Good evening. I'm Sally Hernandez, the news anchor on KXAN TV here in Austin. And yes, we are back in the town of Lockhart, where Governor Abbott chose to highlight this business, Texas Visionary Fiber Technologies. And we have a panel of experts and lawmakers here. You'll recognize, of course, we have State Senator Royce West, a Democrat representing Senate District 23, which includes Dallas. He's been with the Texas Senate for nearly 30 years. And we'll go along and introduce everybody as we move along through the night here to talk about a lot to unpack here. Senator West, let's go ahead and start with you. What did you think about the governor's address? What did you like about it?
Well, he gave a clear vision of where Texas is right now and as it relates to our success in terms of our economy, in terms of where we would rank if we were rated as a country. But when we begin to look at the issues, there was a lot of support for police, for law enforcement, but there was no issue, there was no mention of accountability in terms of Black Lives Matter, issues concerning accountability for police officers. We talk about being number one, but they're in this country in terms of economy and in this world, but there was no real mention of that we're number one in terms of the number of uninsured. And there's a lot of work that we need to do as it relates to the uninsured here in the country.
Representative Jeannie Morrison, just a background here for our viewers. This is your 11th term in the legislature. Republican representing House District 30, which does include Victoria and a stretch of our Gulf Coast. Going off of what Senator West is saying, how would you describe the Democrats' response to the governor's message and how passionate they were on some of those issues about racial justice and injustice?
Well, I think the Democrats are very passionate. We're all passionate, and we all want to work together during this legislative session to make sure that we address any issues. We're going to be working together, and I think that's the theme that the governor gave to us tonight. We will be working together to come to consensus and make sure that we address all the issues that we all are concerned about.
Let's talk about the first thing the governor talked about in his speech there, COVID pandemic, which is why, of course, we are here tonight. You also have seen the lawmakers behind us over Zoom on the large panels. This is a first that we're seeing a governor address the state outside of the Capitol, Josh. And he painted a picture of the COVID-19 response as Texas is doing great. Democrats didn't see it that way in that message. And by the way, Josh Hinkle, I introduce you as Josh all the time just because you're my friend, but Josh Hinkle over here is our host of State of Texas, the politics program, and you've been covering politics for the past decade or more. Any surprises in this speech?
Well, he talked a lot about the emergency items he wanted to tackle and have the legislature tackle. It seems right now, at least our viewers with KXAN, and I know Texans across the state, are very concerned when you talk about the coronavirus, specifically with the vaccination rollout. In the Austin area, there have been a lot of problems with the system and in other communities across Texas. And I think that immediately, emergency, that's what comes to mind for me.
It wasn't an emergency item, though. Representative Morrison, was that a mistake?
Well, I think we all see COVID as an emergency item. We have never been through a pandemic before, and so I think the governor has done a very good job of rolling out what he had to work with. We only get our COVID vaccines from the federal government, and so we can only dispense what we receive. But on the per capita, that's how we receive it. But I know there have been some hiccups, but this is something we've never done before, and I think the governor has done a good job of working with all of us and helping us do it in our areas. I mean, tell him what we need and how we can address it. And so I think we're doing a good job, and the last couple of weeks we've done a great job of getting the vaccines out.
Senator West, I want to touch on that with you in a bit, but first I want to introduce Jim Henson here. He's the director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas, and why his perspective is so appreciated tonight is because you conduct statewide polling. So what do Texans have to say about the COVID-19 crisis? Is it an emergency that is still very top of mind?
Well, you know, where people stand on the pandemic is very shaped by how they frame it and their partisan position. As the pandemic was really peaking in the fall in the University of Texas Tribune poll, we asked people how concerned they were about spread in their community. Among Democrats, 69% were either extremely or very concerned Among Republicans, only 19% were very or extremely concerned. So there's a real difference in how people are experiencing the pandemic and then how they view the policy response.
Senator West, are your constituents telling you that they're able to get a COVID-19 shot easily?
No, I mean, they're not able to, but let's put it in perspective. The reality is we haven't been here before in our lifetime in terms of a pandemic. So I'm not going to sit up and say the governor's doing a bad job. You know, the reality is that he has Hellistat, who's the Commissioner of Health, and also NIMKID, the Texas Management Office, in place. And if for some reason they were not being responsive to members of the legislature, whether they're Democrats or Republican, then I'd be the first one to stand up and say, Governor, you're not doing your job. But let's not turn around and sit up and say a person's not doing their job when initially no one's ever been in a situation before. Let's make certain we continue to work with him. And if they're not responsive, then make certain that people in the state of Texas know they're not responsive.
We have some agreement on the response to the COVID-19 pandemic from Senator Royce and Representative Morrison here. Disagreement, though, when it comes to something else, and it has to do with the nation that is torn, the issue of race and policing. Let's start off with you, Josh. Let's talk about why the governor did not talk so much about race. He was very passionate tonight about the need for public safety from a law enforcement perspective. And he doesn't want to he wants to have a law that makes sure that cities do not defund police. So he's very passionate about that. But he didn't mention policing and race together.
Yeah, I think that was one of the biggest differences you saw between his speech and the Democratic response. Democrats obviously, talked a lot about race and how it has been a part of the conversation, not just with justice, but with the coronavirus, with education, with so many other facets of what our government is having to deal with right now. I think the biggest thing that I thought about when he was talking about policing was his early support at possibly, the legislature looking at the George Floyd Act. And I know, Senator, you can talk about that.
Well, in fact, I mentioned it to him tonight, and he was open to supporting legislation dealing with police accountability. I was dismayed that he didn't mention that in his speech, because that's an emergency, not only in Texas, but in this country. And the reality is that when you begin to look at the hobby school poll, it showed that like 72% of Texans want to see the George Floyd Act passed. And so from that vantage point, I'm hoping that the governor will, just like the passion that he had behind supporting police, that he also makes certain he has the same passion concerning accountability for law enforcement.
Representative Morrison, what are your constituents telling you about policing and racial
Well,
injustices?
as any government's first responsibility is to keep their citizens safe. And so I definitely support law enforcement. But I also want to work with my colleagues and Senator West to make sure that there is accountability. That is something that there definitely needs to be. And so we have to make sure that we work together. And I think that will happen because we will be working together to find accountability, but also to be very supportive of our law enforcement officers also.
The governor also talking about jobs and the economy, saying that Texas is doing great, leading the nation. He says when it comes to economic development, he says Texas is adding jobs. Julian Castro saying that actually that's not the case. Representative Morrison, is the governor doing enough that he needs to do when it comes to getting Texans back to work?
Well, I think one of the things the governor did was making sure that businesses could reopen. If you look at the states that are staying shut during COVID, if you look at New York and California, it has not helped them. I mean, their numbers are just getting more and more people that have COVID as they're staying inside. I think the governor has worked really hard to make sure that we're safe, but also that we have our economy and that people have their jobs and get back to work.
But bottom line, there aren't enough jobs right now. The #1 viewer complaint that we have coming into our newsroom is from people that are not able to access their unemployment benefits. There is a critical problem with the Texas Workforce Commission right now and the way that the system has not been able to serve Texans the way it's supposed to. Every single day we get dozens of emails from people saying, I cannot get my benefits. I have been on the phone for hours. I have not been able to feed my family. And this is something that I feel like was not part of his speech that perhaps a lot of people were hoping he would focus on.
Well, Jim, you would have perspective. Please go ahead, Senator
And
West.
that's exactly right. When you hear about, you ask about district, we get a lot of complaints about the TWC system and about being able to file for workers, their wages through the agency, not being able to do it, or being able to appeal decisions that are being made, or instances where their identity is being stolen. And checks are going to persons like that. 7 million people in the state of Texas, you know, unemployed, that file unemployment claims. We've got to make certain we do better in terms of that system. We're going to have to work together in order to get that done. I would hope that it's not just a Republican solution, but it needs to be a Republican and a Democrat solution. We need to be doing more things on a bipartisan basis in terms of authors of these bills. Even though Republicans control the legislature, if we're going to get things done, let's work together in order to get them done.
Jim, I'm just curious on what Texans think when it comes to jobs. Is that #1 on their mind?
Well, it depends how you ask, but one thing we do know is that we used to see prior to the pandemic, prior to the recent economic dislocations because of the pandemic, that when you asked people about their assessments of their economic situation, it was really fundamentally shaped by partisanship, who was in charge of policy. The objective conditions have gotten serious enough, the kinds of problems everyone is talking about, that we've seen that kind of drop out. Republicans and Democrats are now both saying, I'm doing worse off than I was a year ago. I think the state is worse off than it was a year ago. So however people are trying to interpret it, the fundamental experiences that people are having are much harder than they've been in Texas for a long time.
Right.
And can I jump in
Please.
real quickly? And I agree with Senator West. You know, we get a lot of phone calls helping people with the Workforce Commission, but there again, they were inundated in a system that they didn't have any way to keep up with because they have never been through a pandemic either. But that is one thing. Jobs are very important, and we've got to make sure, Senator West too, that we do work together. And we will work together, and I'm looking forward to working with you because people do need to get their jobs back. That's why we've got to get the economy open. That's why we have to keep the economy open so people can get their jobs back and can go on with their lives.
Josh, and we'll give you a monthly report on us working together.
There you go.
No, let's not wait for a month. Let's talk about it now. What will you commit tonight to make sure that you work with the Republicans when it comes to not only the economy, affordable health insurance, and then I got to talk about education too.
Oh, that's my favorite subject.
You know, the governor talked about how we still need to continue to fund education. What are you going to commit to tonight, Senator West?
Well, I commit to make certain that the gains that we made last session, HB3, that as a member of the Finance Committee, that we fund that. We make certain the monies that are there. In terms of the governor's talking about connectivity, I'll work with him on connectivity to make certain for once and for all that we make certain that we deal with this digital divide that we continue to talk about and talk about and talk about. In terms of issues concerning the economy, I want to make certain that not only do we continue to make certain that this economy continues to grow, but I want to make certain that the least of thee is able to get insurance and job opportunities in the state. That's what I'll commit to do.
The governor talked about so much of what the progress with education, but I think what we're hearing from parents every day is they're worried about the setbacks that their kids have had when they've had to be at home for months after months, and the progress that they're not making. The failure rate, I think that's a scary thing for a lot of parents and teachers and school districts out there. What do you think?
Absolutely. It is an issue, and I agree with Senator West. Broadband, and that being an emergency item, is huge for me because representing a rural area, we just still have a lot of areas that don't have access. And supporting House Bill 3 and making sure that we fully fund it, I'm committed 100% to do that, and I know Senator West is also. So that's something that we definitely are going to work together to do.
I am running out of time. I know we have a lot to talk about. I got to get this question in, though. The governor talked a lot about some federal issues. This is usually a night where he talks about state issues. Let's go around the table here, and I want to ask you. Let's start with you, Senator West. Is the governor preparing to run for the White House?
Against Kamala Harris? I don't think so.
That's a no. Jim?
You know, I think the governor is preparing for the session, but he's preparing in the same way that he would prepare if he was going to run for president.
All right, got to go quickly.
By talking about national
Could
issues.
be a stump speech to me.
All right.
Well, he's not talked to me about it, but I think he's getting ready for this session, and as Jim said, whatever comes after that, we'll see.
We are out of time. Make sure that you watch Josh, of course, with State of Texas Sunday morning on your local Nexstar TV station. Robert, back to you at the Capitol. Thank you all.